Yesterday, I talked about how the Total CARES Act was seeking to bail out everything and everybody, just not equally, and talked about all this. But this is a part of it. This is chump change compared to the really, really big bailout that's happening. And it's happening quietly, and it's happening with your tax dollars. If you're a U.S. citizen, it's happening behind the scenes. And so what's happening is what we could call here a case of privatized gains and socialized losses. This was a really great article by Jim Bianco, and I consider him to be a friend on Twitter. We know each other through that. The Fed's cure risks being worse than the disease. This is really great writing. So let's go through this, because this is all the stuff the Fed is doing. And what are they doing? They're bailing out hedge funds, big money speculators, big banks, people who make money by using money. Those are financialized people. These are mostly the Fed's bailing out people who don't produce anything. And they just are the very wealthiest. So you need to understand that, because while they do that, they're putting the taxpayer on the hook for this if it goes wrong. Jim explains how. In just these past few weeks, the Fed has cut rates by 150 basis points to near zero and run through its entire 2008 crisis handbook. That wasn't enough to calm markets, though, so the central bank also announced $1 trillion a day in repurchase agreements and unlimited quantitative easing, which includes a hard-to-understand $625 billion of bond buying a week going forward. At this rate, the Fed will own 2/3 of the Treasury market in a year. So this will just be the central bank just fully monetizing the U.S. deficits and debts. It's going to be astonishing. But it's alphabet soup of new programs that deserve special consideration, as they could have profound long-term consequences for the functioning of the Fed and the allocation of capital in financial markets. Specifically, these are CPFF, the commercial paper funding facility, which is buying commercial paper from the issuer. The issuer is like if Coca-Cola wants to issue a bond, it would normally go to the bond market. The bond market would evaluate that, say, here's the rate of interest that we think is fair, all things considered. And then Coke would have to attract those particular investors. In this case, what we're talking about is the Fed going straight to commercial paper issuers and buying the bonds directly. So this is the Fed funneling money straight to companies. The primary market corporate credit facility, the PMCCF, is buying corporate bonds from the issuer. Corporate bonds. This is commercial paper. Term asset-backed securities loan facility. This is a funding backstop for asset-backed securities. So this is all the stuff that went wrong in the first housing crisis and the great financial crisis 2008. Guess what? It came back. You know why it came back? Because there were no consequences back then, and because you can make a lot of money bundling up asset-backed securities and selling them off, and it all works great until things go bad. And then luckily the Fed rides to your rescue, buys them from you. All right, the SMCCF is buying corporate bonds and bond ETFs in the secondary market, so this isn't sufficient buying them straight from the issuers here for commercial paper corporate bonds, but now they're going out and buying ETFs in the so-called secondary market. And this is all driving up the prices of these bonds enormously. And how about the Main Street Business Lending Program? Details are to come, but it will lend to eligible small and medium-sized businesses, complementing efforts by the SBA. And so how can it do this? Is the Fed allowed to do all this stuff? The answer is no. It can't do that. Jim continues, to put it bluntly, the Fed isn't allowed to do any of this. The central bank is only allowed to purchase or lend against securities that have government guarantee. So that includes Treasury securities, agency mortgage-backed securities, and the debt issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So by the way, these agency mortgage-backed securities, Fannie and Freddie, they issue these mortgage-backed securities. You know what's going bad right about now? Mortgage-backed securities. You know what should be happening to mortgage-backed securities prices? They should be falling. And because of that, people who owned those would actually be losing money. I'm going to get to it in a minute and show you that the Fed is making sure that anybody who was a big player who is playing around in these markets will not be losing any money. An argument can be made that can also include municipal securities, but nothing in the laundry list above. So how can they do this? The Fed will announce a special purpose vehicle, SPV. A special purpose vehicle. That's just a legal construct. I can explain it. It's not that hard to understand, so don't get lost in the jargon here. but they're going to create this special purpose vehicle for each acronym. What are those acronyms? These things here. For each acronym to conduct these operations. The Treasury, using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is parked in the Treasury, which means it is taxpayer-backed, will make an equity investment in each SPV and be a first loss position. So if there are going to be losses, if all this money goes out the door and it turns out it was a bad idea buying any of this stuff at full price and there's losses to be taken, who's going to take the loss? Well, it's the Treasury. Who's the Treasury? As the taxpayer. So the Fed is going to provide all the money so that the Treasury can throw it at all these really dumb ideas out here. By the way, there's going to be big losses racking up in some of these. And if that goes bad, the taxpayer's on the hook for that. So what does this mean? In essence, the Treasury, not the Fed, is buying all these securities and backstopping of loans. The Fed is acting as the banker and providing the financing. The Fed hired BlackRock Incorporated to purchase these securities and handle the administration of the SPVs on behalf of the owner of the Treasury. And oh, by the way, BlackRock is going to be able to buy out of some of these funds that it owns itself. So conflict of interest there. At any rate, the taxpayer is really being put on the hook for bailing out all of this paper and all this crazy stuff, including backstop for asset-backed securities. Again, we learned nothing from the first one. So let's look at this. Here we see this is these are some of these Fannie and Freddie. These are Fannie bonds, and these things. Notice here in March they started to really fall in price. They started to fall in price. They're falling in price, right? And so anybody who owned these was losing money. And then all of a sudden the Fed said, "Hey, we're going to start buying those." And next thing you know, they're not even at this is par. This is what they were issued at 100. That would be the same price as these investors bought it at. Before they'd even taken any losses, the Fed said, we'll buy them. And next thing you know, they're going to be selling these things at a profit. So no losses for the 0.1% because the 0.1% are mostly the ones who own most of these anyway, by 0.1% of wealthy. Lisa writes here today, the Fed's decision to buy corporate bonds has turned everyone into a buyer, and yet net downgrades among investment-grade bonds accelerated to $110 billion on Monday from $91 billion on Friday. The pace of downgrades continues to accelerate from the record pace reached last week, according to B of A research. As the downgrades happen, the prices for these bonds fall, looks like this, and the holders of those would actually be losing money. But guess what? The Fed's going to buy those now and make sure that nobody loses any money. And you know what I tweeted in response to that? I said, this is a massive bailout of the current 0.1% holders of corporate bonds, same as if your worst performing 401k holding was being bought by the Federal Reserve for as much or more than you paid. This is flat out, it's disgusting, it's unfair, it's demoralizing. It's idiotic. Why is it demoralizing? Because if I invest in the market and I have a 401k and I experience some losses in there, the Fed never comes forward and says, here, we'll buy those things from you, Chris. We'll reach into your 401k, find your worst performing thing that you bought, the dog, the bad investment idea. You made a bad bet. It didn't go your way. We're going to take that worst thing out of your portfolio. And you know what? We're not only going to pay you what you bought it for, we'll give you a little extra for your trouble. That's what's happening here. And that's really unfortunate, and it's terrible for any sense of fairness, justice, equality, a sense of togetherness. This is all about the fourth turning, right? You could not possibly engineer a better way to put rocket fuel on top of people's loss of faith in institutions to watch the big banks and the big bankers and the Treasury Department all conspiring together to bail themselves and all their rich friends out while throwing relative pennies to actual individuals. $1,000 a person for you, but hundreds of billions for large corporations and trillions. There's $4.5 trillion on the hook here to bail out all the people who inappropriately owned bad things the investments that went bad. All right. With that, resubscribe if you can stand hearing screeds like that, because that's what we're down to now. Is I'm really annoyed that where we could be doing things that could really be helping individuals, what we're doing instead is bailing out people who made the same stupid mistakes they made back in 2008. And the first instinct of my country in the United States always is to bail out all the big players. And I know. They're like, oh, if we don't do this, everything will collapse. You know what? Maybe these people should lose a lot of money, and maybe a couple of big institutions ought to collapse, and maybe next time they won't do all this junk again. That'd be wonderful. All right. Conclusions for today. Never letting a good crisis go to waste. Wall Street and corporate America are busy making sure all the losses are borne by the public. That's the taxpayers, both now and in the future. If we look at it this way, people are getting $1,200 today on an individual basis if you as long as you are earning $75,000 or less, which a lot of people don't now qualify for getting any money, of course, in that story. But you get that $1,200 today, you got to pay taxes on it because, hey, it's income. And then you're going to get an $8,000 bill for that $1,200 later on. That's how this all sort of shakes out right now. This is it's radically, totally unfair, and it doesn't make any short-term sense, doesn't make any long-term sense. It's just pigs at the trough. It's really, that's what we're watching right now. And of course, a crisis is a great time to push stuff like that through. So that's really what happened, and your representatives in Congress and the Senate have let you down and failed you if you think this is unfair.